Welcome back to Inside Criminology. I'm your host, and in today's episode, based on Chapter 6 of Larry J. Siegel's Criminology, we explore the streets where crime begins. What happens when communities break down? How do poverty, urban decay, and social disorganization drive crime? Join me as we examine how structure shapes behavior and how collective action might be the key to prevention. Okay, let's dive into the core idea here from the source material. This really powerful argument. The disadvantaged economic class position isn't just a factor in crime, but maybe even a primary one.
Right. This perspective sees crime as, well, bubbling up from the social and economic forces happening in those areas, the ones grappling with poverty and deterioration.
What's so interesting about this view is this shift in focus, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's not saying certain individuals are just inherently flawed or criminal. Instead, it's asking, what is it about the environment, the structure of society that sort of creates the conditions where crime is just more likely to happen?
Yeah, it suggests that these bigger social and economic forces can actually shape or maybe constrain individual choices
Oh.
in ways that might lead towards criminal behavior.
It's looking at the whole forest, not just the individual trees, exactly.
And the sources lay out three main ways this social structure perspective is kind of broken down. You've got social disorganization theory, strain theory, and cultural deviance theory.
Mm-hmm.
For this deep dive, we're going to focus mostly on social disorganization and how that decay, that breakdown of community structure, contributes to crime.
Okay.
So to really get this, we first have to look at the socioeconomic landscape of the U.S., at least as the sources describe it. It paints a picture of a society that's, well, highly stratified.
Stratified, meaning layers upon layers, right?
Hmm.
Created by a really unequal distribution of things like wealth, obviously, but also power, prestige.
Yeah.
It creates these social classes groups who have very different shares of, well, the good stuff in life, and often live vastly different realities. And the data the sources give us is pretty jarring.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, think about this. The poorest fifth of households in the U.S. get only about 3.5% of the total income pie. Just 3.5%.
While the wealthiest fifth, they grab over 50%.
Over half.
And the top 5% of households, they rake in something like 22.4% all by themselves. I mean, that's not just a gap, it's a chasm. It defines people's opportunities from day one, really.
Totally. And the sources note, millions worldwide, and even a couple million right here in the U.S., sitting on over $1 million in assets. Meanwhile, in lower-class neighborhoods, you see the complete opposite.
Right, you see inadequate housing, limited healthcare access, family structures under immense pressure, and that persistent joblessness, or maybe just underemployment.
The feeling isn't just hardship. The sources suggest it's often this profound despair.
Yeah. And when you couple that lived reality with a society that's constantly, bombarding you with images and messages, linking your self-worth to material possessions, but you have no conventional way, no real path to achieve that kind of wealth.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. The sources suggest this disconnect, this gap, can push people in these areas towards, let's say, unconventional or illegal solutions.
Sure. We're talking drug dealing, theft, robbery, ways to maybe get resources or status outside the normal system.
Or, tragically, sometimes even self-medication through illegal channels, just to escape the depression and hopelessness.
It really raises that crucial question, doesn't it? How much are these behaviors about personal choice versus how much are they a consequence of the deeply unequal hand society has dealt you?
And diving deeper into that inequality, the sources really emphasize the particularly harsh impact this has on children.
Oh, absolutely. Children actually face significantly higher poverty rates than any other age group, higher than adults, higher than the elderly.
Wow.
And the sources suggest that experiencing poverty during those really crucial early childhood years, that might have a more severe and lasting impact than experiencing it later in life.
The evidence seems pretty clear. Kids in poverty are less likely to do well in school, less likely to graduate, they face more health problems, and have declining access to health care.
And those in extreme poverty or kids who live in poverty year after year, they suffer the worst outcomes across the board. It affects basically everything.
Like what?
Well, from their birth weight, literally, right up to their chances of getting a college degree. Even just the quality of their housing can negatively influence their psychological health.
Yeah.
The sources describe these social problems in lower class areas as spreading almost like an epidemic, eroding the community's ability to function, leaving behind what they call hollowed out neighborhoods.
And those racial disparities in child poverty are just incredibly stark. I mean, while about a quarter of kids under 6 live in poverty overall.
Which is not enough.
Right. Only about 6% of young white children are classified as extremely poor. Compare that to roughly 50% half of young black children. That difference is just immense.
It's staggering.
This leads us right into the concept of the underclass and that disproportionate burden carried by minority groups.
Right. So you have sociologists like Oscar Lewis, who's mentioned in the sources. He described what he called a culture of poverty.
Yeah?
This idea of a set of attitudes like apathy, cynicism, a deep mistrust of institutions that he felt could sort of be passed down through generations in persistently poor communities.
And then there was Gunnar Myrdal's idea of an underclass existing globally, people cut off from the rest of society, lacking the education and skills needed for modern life.
What's really key here, I think, is how that economic disparity doesn't just mean less money. It means less access to opportunities for developing skills,
Okay.
which in turn increases the risk of things like crime and drug abuse. And when people in these areas perceive that maybe their neighbors lack conventional connections, maybe they suspect they're involved in crime themselves,
Yeah.
it just chips away at the community's ability to stick together, to address problems collectively. Cohesiveness goes down.
And the sources are pretty unambiguous. The weight of this underclass existence falls most heavily on minority groups. I mean, while poverty rates have thankfully declined faster among minorities than whites.
Which is good news, relatively speaking.
Relatively, yes. But still, over 20% of African Americans and Latino Americans still live below the poverty line. Compare that to less than 10% of whites.
And the median family income. For Latino and African American families, it's only about 2/3 that of white families, still a huge gap.
A study cited from California really drives this home. It found Latino and low-income children were 4 times less likely to have health insurance.
Wow.
And you also see these significant ethnic gaps in things like preschool enrollment, which just sets kids up for a challenging start before they even hit kindergarten.
It really stacks the deck early on.
And then the criminal justice system itself can become a trap. The sources mentioned that in some areas, up to half of minority males are under some form of correctional control, prison, probation, parole.
And the sheer cost of navigating that system, lawyers, court fees that can absolutely devastate families financially and just perpetuate the cycle of poverty.
So it makes a pretty powerful case, doesn't it, that differences in crime rates between racial groups might be less about race itself
Right.
and more about the profound differences in their standard of living, their economic reality.
Yeah, the sources suggest, if those economic disparities were somehow eliminated, maybe the differences in crime rates would shrink too.
Let's look at William Julius Wilson's work here. Very influential. He described the truly disadvantaged.
Right, those folks socially isolated in urban inner cities, often the victims of historical and ongoing discrimination.
His key insight, as I understand it, is how the breakdown or decline of basic community institutions, families struggling, under-resourced schools, inadequate housing.
Oh, that vital infrastructure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How that leads to a loss of community cohesion. This lack of unity makes it incredibly difficult for the neighborhood to collectively control issues like crime and drugs.
Yeah, think about something as simple as neighbors feeling comfortable enough to tell each other's kids to, quiet down or stop misbehaving. That kind of basic informal control often just vanishes in really distressed areas.
And he explored this specifically in his book, When Work Disappears, looking at the devastating impact of joblessness and underemployment, particularly on Chicago's South Side.
Right. He noted areas where maybe for the first time the majority of adults simply weren't working in a typical week.
That's hard to even imagine.
It is. And this isn't just about a lack of individual jobs, it's systemic. Globalization, the movement of those manufacturing jobs overseas those jobs, used to provide a real pathway to the middle class for many African Americans.
And when they left.
The service and retail jobs that depended on that blue-collar spending, they dried up too. So what's left are often these economies heavily reliant on welfare and government support.
And that widespread absence of work, it just tears at the community's social fabric, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Work does more than just provide a paycheck. It socializes young people, teaches values like discipline, responsibility, connects them to the wider world.
So when work is scarce,
That structure, that discipline is lost. Community-wide underemployment just hollows out social cohesion, leading to this cascade of social problems. Schools struggle, there are fewer working adult role models, kids aren't really socialized into the norms and expectations of the mainstream economy. It's a profound disruption.
Wilson, in later work like The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, He broadened his focus, arguing that growing inequality isn't just a minority issue. It's hurting ordinary families of all races.
Yeah, he advocated for this coalition across racial and class lines to push for policies that benefit everyone, things like full employment, strong family support programs, and rebuilding what he called affirmative opportunity for all.
He also noted how racism might be operating more subtly now, that maybe some white individuals might attribute the economic struggles of black individuals to, like, cultural issues rather than systemic barriers.
Right. And their own anxieties about job security and a changing economy can make them less willing, maybe, to support assistance programs for the poor.
Plus, the physical reality of suburban life often isolates more affluent populations from the realities faced by minorities concentrated in central cities. The problems seem distant, maybe abstract.
And the economy's increasing reliance on technology just decreases demand for low-skilled labor, which disproportionately harms African Americans who are historically channeled into those fields.
Okay, so that gives us a really solid understanding of the socioeconomic backdrop here. Now let's really zero in on that first main branch of social structure theory we mentioned, social disorganization theory.
Okay. This theory directly links crime rates to the characteristics of certain neighborhoods, specifically areas that are transient, where residential and commercial uses are all mixed up, where populations are constantly changing. It's in these places, the theory goes, where the social life of a community is most frayed, most disorganized.
So disorganized areas are those that struggle to provide basic services, right? Where you see high unemployment, lots of rental properties with people constantly moving in and out, families under a lot of stress.
Exactly. And that environment tends to breed conflict, frustration, despair. It becomes fertile ground for antisocial behavior. The core idea is that residents in these crime-ridden areas often want to leave.
Does this make sense?
And that desire weakens their investment in the community, their willingness to participate in local institutions, family, school, businesses, social services, the things that normally exert social control.
Yeah. If you don't plan on staying, why get involved? Why put down roots?
Yeah.
And that constant turnover of residents, it makes it incredibly difficult for people to even get to know each other, build relationships, or work together towards common goals or solving neighborhood problems.
Which brings us to the absolutely foundational work here, the work of Shaw and McKay. They really pioneered social disorganization theory.
They did this groundbreaking work in Chicago, right, back in the early 1920s. And they were heavily influenced by those ideas from Park and Burgess about how cities grow in distinct ecological zones.
And Chicago at that time was the perfect laboratory. It was just exploding in population waves of immigrants, families from the rural South moving in, often getting pushed into the oldest, most hazardous housing. You could see the physical decay.
And there was real concern among the city's elite about rising crime, which, as the sources note, was often wrongly blamed on the perceived inferiority of these new groups.
Yeah, there are even social movements trying to save the children of the poor, viewing it through that lens.
So Shaw and McKay, they zeroed in on what they called transitional neighborhoods.
Right. Those inner city areas marked by extreme poverty and just constant population churn, high turnover. They saw these places as simply incapable of holding on to residents long term, or effectively defending themselves against crime.
Because the low rents attracted all these diverse groups, often newly arrived.
Exactly. And the kids growing up there were kind of caught between the traditions of their parents and the pressures of adapting to this new, often confusing urban culture. The informal social controls they might have had back home or in a more stable community were completely disrupted.
They saw these areas as literal spawning grounds for young criminals.
Pretty much. As different groups moved through, the traditional neighborhood culture and organization just dissolved. It was a constant state of flux, leaving kids feeling adrift without strong values or clear guidance to hold on to.
And they used that concentric zones model from Burgess to map crime rates.
They did. And what they found was really remarkable. Crime rates were consistently highest in those transitional inner city zones, zones and 2, they called them. These were the places where the newest and poorest residents typically settled.
And as you move further out from the city center,
crime rates dropped off significantly, lower rates in the outer zones.
Okay, but here's the part that was really the game changer, right? They found that this pattern, this high crime in zones 1 and 2, It remained incredibly stable over like 65 years.
65 years. Even when the specific ethnic or racial group living there changed completely over time.
That's the key.
That finding was such a powerful rebuttal to the idea that crime was somehow tied to the inherent traits of specific groups. It strongly suggested that the conditions of the neighborhood itself, the poverty, the turnover, the lack of organization, were the consistent predictor of crime, not the identity of the residents.
And in these transitional areas, you had multiple cultures and value systems existing side by side, including deviant ones.
Right, and they saw how the street culture could present successful deviant adults who, gamblers, pimps, drug dealers, who appeared to be thriving financially, at least on the surface.
So kids growing up in the slums, seeing this,
They might internalize a different set of values. They might form gangs, embrace deviant goals, and essentially pass on a delinquent tradition within that specific community environment. It created this deep conflict with middle-class norms that seemed impossible to achieve through conventional means anyway.
so their enduring legacy is really this. Crime isn't fundamentally caused by individual problems, biological, psychological, intellectual, whatever. It's a product of these destructive ecological conditions.
Exactly. It's a constant feature in these areas of poverty and disorganization, regardless of who lives there at any given moment. And their work was absolutely crucial in paving the way for community-based interventions and treatment programs, shifting the focus away from just the individual offender to the social environment.
It also kind of aligns with Durkheim's idea, doesn't it? That crime can be a normal, though obviously undesirable, part of society under certain conditions. Seeing delinquency and adult criminality is almost a predictable response to these really adverse living environments.
Now, their work wasn't without its critics, of course. Some questioned how truly stable these neighborhoods really were. Others found their definition of social disorganization maybe a bit fuzzy, a bit hard to pin down.
But maybe the most significant criticism, one we still grapple with today, is their reliance solely on official police records.
Right. Because high arrest rates in a particular zone might reflect higher levels of police surveillance or maybe even bias against the residents in those areas rather than a truly accurate picture of all the crime being committed across the city.
It's plausible, isn't it, that people in wealthier areas commit crimes too, but maybe they just don't result in arrest or formal recording as often, while those in lower income areas face a much higher likelihood of getting caught and entered into the system.
It's a really important caveat. It reminds us to always be critical of the data sources themselves and what they actually measure.
Despite those criticisms, Shaw and McKay's work sparked this major revival of social disorganization theory in the 1980s, leading to what's sometimes called the social ecology school.
Yeah, this felt like maybe a pure structural theory. It really doubled down on the emphasis on community deterioration and economic decline as the key drivers, perhaps focusing a bit less on the specific cultural transmission aspect that Shaw and McKay highlighted.
And more recent ecological research has really expanded on this, detailing all the factors that contribute to this community breakdown.
First off, there's just overt community deterioration. Crime rates are strongly linked to visible disorder, trash, graffiti, abandoned buildings, even fear itself.
Right.
Deserted houses and apartments aren't just vacant, they become magnets for criminal activity. Areas that are physically falling apart, maybe neglected by landlords, they tend to have the highest rates of violence and gun crime. Even seeing failing retail stores can signal a neighborhood in trouble.
This links right into the broken windows concept, doesn't it? The idea that visible signs of disorder signal that nobody cares, which creates an environment where more serious crime is likely to follow because that informal social control has just evaporated.
Exactly. Then you have the concentration of poverty. As working and middle-class families leave inner cities, those who remain are often increasingly disadvantaged and consolidated into segregated areas.
And those who left took crucial resources with them, financial resources, institutional support.
Right. Businesses become wary of investing there. Banks might be hesitant to lend money for mortgages or home improvements.
And this dynamic often hits minority communities hardest, perpetuating race-based inequality. We talked about black crime rates being influenced by that economic shift, losing manufacturing jobs, leaving fewer lower-paying service jobs behind.
Yes, and that economic pressure can manifest as increased violent crime, maybe desperate acts like armed robberies that go wrong. So something that might look on the surface like racially motivated crime could actually be a direct consequence of economic disadvantage and lack of opportunity rooted in these structural changes.
And here's a nuance that's maybe slightly different from Shaw and McKay's original idea of transitional zones. Sometimes, the most crime-prone areas aren't transient.
Right, they can actually be stable, homogeneous ghettos, quite isolated from the mainstream, where residents are effectively trapped, perhaps in public housing projects. Ethnically and racially isolated areas often show the highest crime rates.
Chronic unemployment is another huge factor identified.
Yeah. While the link between overall national unemployment and crime rates isn't always perfectly clear-cut, neighborhoods with persistent, long-term joblessness consistently show higher rates of social disorganization and crime. Being chronically unemployed, understandably, can lead to higher levels of frustration and potentially antisocial behavior.
High rates of serious crime, like homicide, seem concentrated in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. Research consistently finds these strong links between neighborhood crime rates and factors like the percentage of people in poverty, the prevalence of single-parent or non-traditional households.
Violent crime especially is tied to these markers of disadvantage, poverty percentage, lack of investment, unemployment. Even a large influx of new immigrants can be a destabilizing factor in the short term if they're not integrated well.
And this lack of stability in households can impact how kids are raised, maybe whether they learn to value violence because they see so few opportunities.
It seems plausible. The absence of working adults reduces their stabilizing influence compared to the pull of youth gangs. Elijah Anderson's work, for instance, described how respected older residents, he called them the old heads, were sometimes displaced and influenced by street hustlers and drug dealers. Figures who were admired, maybe envied for their apparent success, even despite their often violent methods.
Community fear is another huge piece of this puzzle, isn't it?
Massive. In cohesive communities where people know each other, trust each other, feel safe, fear is lower. But in disorganized neighborhoods, fear is just pervasive. It's fueled by those visible signs of social and physical incivilities. Rowdy teenagers hanging out, trash in the streets, strangers loitering, public drunkenness.
Just seeing groups of kids hanging out or knowing gangs are present, that generates fear.
Yeah, fear of being approached by drug dealers, for instance, makes people avoid public spaces. And fear is incredibly contagious. As residents become victims or they hear about others being victimized, the word spreads. This neighborhood is dangerous, and people withdraw further from community life.
And victimization itself increases fear, creating this terrible feedback loop.
It does. And in areas with very high death rates and low life expectancies, that fear can contribute to young people making risky choices, discounting their future, maybe leading to higher rates of teenage births or violence. It's this awful cycle. Fear leads to withdrawal, which weakens social control, which allows crime to increase, which generates more fear.
Are there specific factors linked to this heightened fear?
The sources point to several. Race is one. Anxiety over racial or ethnic conflicts can be particularly sharp in neighborhoods going through rapid changes in their racial or age composition. White residents might feel more fear when they sense they're becoming a minority, perhaps based on stereotypes, or maybe a fear that police services might decline in a minority area. Conversely, minority groups might experience greater fear simply because they have fewer resources to protect themselves or to move away.
There was a study mentioned by Ted Chiricos.
Yeah, he found that white fear of Latinos and blacks was most pronounced specifically where whites were outnumbered, and Latinos felt threatened by blacks only where Latinos were the minority. Interesting dynamic.
Gangs are another major driver of fear, obviously.
Huge. They flourish in deteriorated areas precisely because that lack of social control provides fertile ground. And their open activity, like selling drugs right out on the street, doesn't just signal lawbreaking. It fundamentally undermines any sense of community solidarity. It can signal to residents that the police are maybe corrupt or just ineffective.
It shows the gangs have successfully intimidated people.
Right. And this sense of powerlessness among both residents and sometimes even the police just leads to greater fear all around.
Mistrust is also rampant in these areas.
Oh, definitely. The constant exposure to crime and civil disorder breeds this deep suspicion and mistrust among neighbors, but also towards outside institutions. A sense of powerlessness just amplifies the feeling of disorder and increases the mistrust.
This can lead to what's called a siege mentality.
Yeah, where residents feel like the outside world is hostile, maybe even actively against them.
Hmm.
Elijah Anderson, again, documented residents in some African American neighborhoods who believed in conspiracies that things like permanent unemployment, police brutality, mass imprisonment, even the spread of AIDS were outcomes intentionally orchestrated or maybe just ignored by white officials because of lax law enforcement in poor areas.
And this mistrust extends to conventional institutions like businesses, government, schools.
Absolutely. Residents feel self-conscious, constantly worried about being disrespected, highly attuned to perceived slights. And this deep mistrust can fuel anger and sometimes violent reactions, especially when police are seen as ignoring crime or are themselves perceived as violent or corrupt.
There's even research showing police tend to use higher levels of force in disadvantaged areas, regardless of the suspect's specific behavior.
Which only reinforces that mistrust, you see.
Finally, community change itself seems to be a defining characteristic.
Yes. Rapid structural shifts, both racial and economic, are strongly associated with changes in crime rates. Neighborhoods are constantly evolving their residents, their wealth levels, their density, their very purpose can change over time.
And as areas decline, those who can afford to leave often do, seeking safer environments.
Leaving behind those who can't, often minority residents due to those economic differences we discussed, facing an increased risk of victimization.
And the constant inflow of new residents creates that high population turnover, which is just devastating for building any kind of community culture. It thwarts efforts to establish communication, share information.
Right. And in that environment, a distinct street culture can develop, sometimes with its own standards of dress, language, behavior that stands in opposition to conventional society.
These cycles of community change building up, declining, changing ethnic makeup, thinning out, maybe eventually seeing some renewal or gentrification. These are periods where crime rates tend to increase.
Yeah, the neighborhoods most vulnerable to rising crime rates seem to be those with high numbers of single-parent or unrelated households, those shifting from owner-occupied homes to rentals, and those losing their base of unskilled jobs.
These ecological disruptions just put immense strain on those informal social control mechanisms. Changes in lifestyles, demographics, they're clearly linked to increases in crime.
And even areas right next to racially changing neighborhoods can sometimes see crime increases, maybe reflecting community reactions, perceived racial conflict, or maybe even, disturbingly, adults encouraging youth to act out or use violence to resist newcomers.
Okay, wow. So we've explored these really powerful forces of social disorganization. But the sources also present a kind of counterbalance, right? An opposite concept that offers maybe a glimmer of what works, collective efficacy.
Yes, exactly. This is the characteristic found in cohesive communities, those areas where neighbors know and trust each other, where they're more socially integrated.
How would you define collective efficacy for us, just simply?
Well, at its heart, it's about mutual trust among neighbors, combined with a shared willingness to actually step in for the common good.
Like what kind of stepping in?
Things like supervising children you see out in public, even if they're not yours. Or maybe confronting people engaged in low-level disorder, public drinking, vandalism, that sort of thing. It's fostered by neighborhood cohesion and these shared expectations about what's acceptable behavior and how people should informally look out for each other.
And the payoff in these areas, they tend to have better outcomes across the board, don't they?
They do. Better education, better health care, better housing, and significantly for our discussion, lower crime rates.
Exactly. Contrast that with disorganized neighborhoods where those efforts at social control are weak, maybe blunted. Residents perceive more disorder, more danger.
And when those informal controls are weak, crime rates tend to go up, which only further erodes trust and cohesion, creating another one of those vicious cycles, but in the negative direction this time.
But where collective efficacy is high, communities are able to harness the power of their local institutions to actually control crime.
And the sources break this down into three main forms of control that make up collective efficacy. The first is informal social control.
Okay, so this is the closest level. Peers, families, relatives.
Exactly, the primary, private level. They exert control by giving or withholding approval through, criticism, maybe ridicule, ostracism, even punishment within families.
And the family is the most crucial part of this, especially where wider community ties are low.
Yeah, in those cases, parents end up bearing a much greater burden for supervising their kids. Even something simple like informal surveillance neighbors just keeping an eye on each other's property that can help reduce certain crimes like street robberies. But unfortunately, that often stops if fear levels get too high. People withdraw.
Makes sense. The second form is institutional social control.
Right. This involves the conventional social institutions in a community: schools, churches, community centers, businesses, things like that. But these institutions can be really ineffective in a climate of deep alienation and mistrust, like you find in disorganized areas.
Unsupervised youth groups, gangs, they can actively disrupt the positive influence of these institutions.
They can. And residents in disorganized areas often have less involvement with, or maybe feel shut out from, these conventional institutions. When there's a lack of structured programs, especially after school, kids become much more vulnerable to gang recruitment.
So crime flourishes where this institutional control is weak. Fear increases, cohesion decreases, and the institution's ability to exert positive influence just weakens further.
But conversely, where collective efficacy is strong, institutions become sources of control. Local businesses, stores, schools, churches, social service agencies, they all play a role. Research has actually linked effective institutions to declines in crimes like burglary.
It's interesting, though, that some institutions lower crime, like community rec centers maybe, while others, like certain types of bars or taverns, can actually destabilize a neighborhood and potentially increase violent crime.
That's a good point. It depends on the nature of the institution. Finally, there's public social control.
This is about getting outside help, like police, funding.
Exactly. It's about the community's ability to marshal external resources, getting adequate police presence, securing funding for programs. And political clout is pretty essential here to lobby effectively for those resources.
A strong, visible police presence can signal that a community won't tolerate crime, maybe prevent criminal groups from getting a foothold.
Right. Criminals tend to steer clear of areas where they perceive that kind of coordinated effort and intolerance. Unfortunately, disorganized areas often lack the political power to secure that necessary funding and personnel.
So they end up with fewer, maybe less motivated police resources.
Which means they simply can't mount an effective external control effort. And it creates yet another feedback loop where, as neighborhood disadvantage and disorganization increase, the ability of the community to exercise any form of control, whether it's informal, institutional, or public, just declines further.
So to kind of wrap up this deep dive, the core argument from these social structure theories, particularly social disorganization, it's a really powerful one, isn't it? Crime isn't just about the individual. It seems profoundly rooted in the environment, the unequal socioeconomic structure, and the breakdown of the very social fabric within specific neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's a perspective that really forces us to look beyond just individual pathology, individual choices, and see how poverty, visible disorder, lack of opportunity, weakened social ties, pervasive fear, and a fundamental lack of trust all combine. They create these environments where crime becomes, in a really tragic sense, almost a predictable outcome.
It frames crime not just as a series of bad choices by bad people, but as a complex systemic problem stemming from these really powerful social forces.
Absolutely.
So, considering everything we've discussed today, especially that contrasting idea of collective efficacy, that mutual trust, that willingness to intervene, here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider. If the problem is fundamentally about social structure and its breakdown, does the concept of collective efficacy suggest that maybe the most potent solutions might lie not just with external authorities like police or government programs, but within the power of communities themselves to rebuild trust and shared responsibility? Can building that internal strength, that collective efficacy, truly overcome the powerful, entrenched forces of disorganization and inequality that we've described?